This video is sponsored by Squarespace. In my opinion, Red Bull are going to sell Alpha Tauri. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not even in a week or 2 weeks or a month from now. But I think the writing is on the wall. Why? Well, I've got a bunch of reasons. So I want you to hear me out and let me know in the comments below whether or not you agree. The massive multinational energy drink company Red Bull agreed to purchase the Jaguar Formula 1 team from the Ford Motor Company on the 15th of November 2004, the Milton Keynes based team that has now become Red Bull Racing. 351 days later, on the 1st of November 2005, Red Bull took over a second team, purchasing Italian Minnows Minardi from owner Paul Stoddard and immediately rebranding them to Scuderia Toro Rosso. Toro Rosso is Red Bull in Italian, by the way. Now, Red Bull Racing would of course go on to become the main focus of Red Bull's attention, the team that would eventually become a 4-time World Championship winner on the trot with Sebastian Vettel, and won last year, and right now is looking the most dominant car on the grid. Not just car, team on the grid. Scuderia Toro Rosso would function as more of a boot camp, a stepping stone, a proving ground for the next brightest young talent to line them up for the main Red Bull Racing seat. So that's well over 15 years Red Bull have been involved in both teams. But in that time, the sport has changed a hell of a lot. And as the sport continues to evolve and continues to change with the new regulations in 2026, the cost cap, Audi joining the party as well, I think the case for Red Bull holding on to that second team grows weaker by the year. So let's start with the language that Red Bull used to refer to this team, because since they started, they were the junior team. That's how Red Bull openly referred to Scuderia Toro Rosso. But since the rebranding of that team from Toro Rosso to Alpha Tauri ahead of the 2020 season, Red Bull have also referred to that team as a sister team, not a junior team anymore. That implies a move away from that focus being a springboard for young talent and more towards a standalone second team that doesn't have direct connection with Red Bull. Now, of course, we know they're still using it for that purpose, but to me, that clearly implies a change in philosophy from the higher ups of how they view that second team. AlphaTauri is a separate company owned by Red Bull. They make clothing. You might have seen my video where I bought an AlphaTauri shirt. I don't actually have it anymore. I donated it to the charity shop because I'm too fat for it, basically. When you look at the 2019 Toro Rosso, it was just as covered in Red Bull stickers as the main car was, right? So you've got to ask, well, if the main car's fighting at the top, what's the value in just having Red Bull in the middle of the grid as well? You might as well promote something else. That makes a lot of sense. But did they have to change the terminology? Did they have to call it a sister team instead of a junior team? No. Red Bull actually founded AlphaTauri way back in 2016, although they didn't launch a collection until 2018. And actually, to be fair, again, at the time when I bought my shirt, I wasn't overly impressed by what I saw, but I think their product range these days in 2022 is way better, not only from what I've seen on the drivers, but looking at their website, I think a lot of this product looks actually pretty slick. It's still really expensive, but it looks good. Although maybe that's more to do with how super slick, minimal and gorgeous their website is, which is the perfect segue to today's video sponsor. I did it again, Squarespace. Maybe you want a website similar for yourself. Maybe you want something totally different to what AlphaTauri have done. Well, with the power of Squarespace, you can build your very own from the comfort of your own home with thousands of award-winning drag and drop templates, 24/7 customer support, whether you're looking for a blog, a portfolio, or you want to sell stuff online, your own little online business, Squarespace can help you out. I've been a customer of Squarespace for years, long predating this YouTube channel, so I'm more than happy to encourage you to join me. Best of all, you can give it a go free of charge, play around with the functionality. It's only when you want to take your finished, beautiful website, put it live to the world, that you have to pay anything. And when that time comes, head to squarespace.com/TommoF1 to save 10% off your first website or domain. So they're using AlphaTauri to sell clobber. Fine. What else? Well, AlphaTauri have partnered with Formula 1. It was announced earlier this year that AlphaTauri is becoming the official premium fashion apparel supplier of Formula 1 from 2022 onwards on a multi-year deal. That means Domenicali himself and anyone who works for Formula 1. Basically, AlphaTauri is now their uniform. Red Bull also leverage Max and Checo to promote the clothing, not just Pierre and Yuki. All of them are always clobbered up in AlphaTauri gear unless they're wearing the actual team merch. And that makes so much sense. I mean, Verstappen and Perez are arguably two of the most commercially powerful drivers on the grid. The Orange Army needs no explanation, is a world championship winner as well. And Sergio Perez is following, not just in Mexico, but the whole Latin American region is fanatical. But ultimately, these points come together for me to lead me to a conclusion that, you know, what's the justification in keeping a second team anymore? Red Bull have chosen to kind of state that they don't feel they need a junior team anymore. And they're already using the main Red Bull drivers who have the biggest pull to advertise AlphaTauri clothing. Why not just chuck the AlphaTauri logo on the main Red Bull car, stick it in a prominent position so it still gets some airtime, and then save the hundreds of millions you're spending on running a second Formula One team? Like, sure, yeah, you get a bit of brand exposure from that car, but it's also in the middle to lower range of the midfield. Surely you'd get just as much, if not more. Yes, it's a smaller logo on the Red Bull, but it's fighting at the front, it's winning races. I just don't think it makes sense for that much longer anymore. Yes, back in the day when they wanted a junior team, fine, but that doesn't seem to be the plan anymore. I mean, look what the rumour mill's saying at the minute about Nick De Vries going to AlphaTauri. That's not a very Red Bull move. The AlphaTauri name is out there. They can keep dressing Max in it, keep dressing Checo in it, fine. Oi, you, subscribe. Maybe the retraction away from a junior team has something to do with a certain driver who is excelling in the present but will continue to excel into the future by the looks of it. Because of course Max Verstappen isn't just the present of that team, he is the future. Red Bull are going to get at least 10 years out of Max, you got to think. That'd take him to 34. He's in his 8th season in Formula 1 and he's still only 24. That is insane. By modern F1 standards, illegal, because he was 17 when he got in an F1 car, which isn't allowed anymore because of the super license. Red Bull don't really need the next big hot prospect. What they need right now is a driver just like Checo, someone who's happy to sit in that seat. Not happy, of course, Checo wants to be winning, but he's not naive. He knows what he's signed up for in that Red Bull seat. He's not going to be able to push Max because Max is just that talented. And why would Red Bull want a second driver to jump in that is going to nip at the heels of Max? You look at the Schumacher-Barrichello relationship, one of the most dominant periods we've seen in Formula One. If anything, the fact that Seb and Mark Webber used to scuffle a few times over those 4 seasons where Seb won back-to-back championships, that could have actually derailed Seb's chances. F1's never going to be short of drivers in their, late 20s, early 30s who have had solid careers and aren't necessarily world beaters but would be more than happy to sit in that second seat. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this from a place of criticism either. I think if Red Bull want to maximise their chances of winning as many drivers' championships as possible, they have to go all in on Verstappen. Maximise the car's performance in a way that he, first and foremost, can extract it. He's committed his future to the team, at least verbally anyway. We heard him, his team radio after Abu Dhabi.
Can we do this for another 10, 50 years together?
Unless the Red Bull drops off a cliff, I don't see him leaving, even if that car fell back to, maybe where the Mercedes is now relative to Red Bull and Ferrari. I think he'd stay. I think he'd still be able to pull out some worldly performances because he is that good. And he clearly has a really strong affinity with that team. Now, maybe accepting that you're going to have one driver up there and one driver down there might affect their, constructors' chances, because you look at Charles and Carlos, you look at George and Lewis, and I feel like they are very close, which helps them pick up more constructors' points. And maybe Checo not being as close means that he won't be able to take points off other teams, which could affect Max Verstappen. If you can hear Minton barking, I don't know why either. But I don't know, as much as teams say that constructors is the most important thing to them, I don't buy it. Who remembers that Ferrari won the 2008 Constructors' Championship? Lewis won the drivers. No one cares. Even last year, Mercedes won the 2021 Constructors' Championship. No one cares. It was all about Max and Lewis. From a marketing point of view, from a legacy point of view, yeah, sure, the constructors might care internally, but the wider world, like when you look back at these records, no one looks at Constructors' Championships. The amount of additional revenue driven by Max Verstappen winning that 2021 Drivers' Championship versus not winning it, in my mind, totally outweighs But anyway, back to the second team, back to AlphaTauri. And I was having a chat last week on the Last Lap podcast, which you should definitely check out, link below, with my old mate, ex-Red Bull Systems engineer, Dan, otherwise known as Engine Mode 11. And from our chat, there was a really interesting little tidbit that kind of took me by surprise because I hadn't heard this before.
Yeah, the whole time I was working at Red Bull, it was always common policy that Alpha Tauri is for sale if you've got the money.
Really?
And apparently it's always been like that.
Oh, wow.
I think Helmut and Dietrich have always said that if anyone wants to buy Alpha Tauri and makes us a decent enough offer, they can have it.
If that team has always been up for sale, then surely today, this modern era, 2022 Formula One, is the most attractive that proposition of purchasing an F1 team has ever been. Cost cap, F1's popularity, exploding the increased electronic component going into 2026. Not to mention the fact that the AlphaTauri team are actually pretty good. They're certainly a lot better than the Minardi team that Red Bull initially purchased back in 2005. Now look, of course, I would rather see teams starting afresh, right? I want to see more than 10. I want 12 teams. That'd be lovely. 24 drivers, 12 teams. But the costs associated with building a facility, hiring competent, top quality staff, and developing an actually competitive package. We don't want any more virgins, the racing team that is. Plus the 200 million buy-in that gets spread between all your competitors. That is a huge ask for a company to come in and find that appealing even now. I mean, Haas only made their new from scratch entry work because they bought loads of auctioned off Marussia parts, including their Banbury headquarters. So even they didn't really start from scratch. They kind of more evolved from Marussia. So what potential suitors are there? Well, Andretti have been banging that F1 drum for a while now. There were significant talks with Sauber, talking about buying a stake, potentially taking over the team. Didn't materialise in the end. But bringing the Andretti name, I know American, but Italian roots there, inheriting that Faenza factory and that personnel and making Andretti Italian again, I guess. That makes sense to me. Then there's Honda, which are the, serial flip-floppers of Formula One. But since the Porsche deal fell through with Red Bull, Christian Horner hasn't written off a return from Honda. I think that significantly increased electrical component in Formula One from 2026 makes, Honda a bit more excited because, they're very much going down the EV route. Suggests to me if that regulation had been announced sooner, then maybe Honda wouldn't have left. Then, of course, there is Porsche, who are clearly interested in getting F1. They even registered that F1 finally, whatever this means. Maybe buying out AlphaTauri in full could be, seen as a more appealing route in because, again, from my understanding, the reason that broke down is that Porsche wanted more control than Red Bull were willing to relinquish. This way they get a whole team just to themselves. Let me know if you've got any other thoughts of potential suitors for that team if Red Bull were to sell up. I mean, Domenicali's talked on record about loads of big investors and big manufacturers interested in getting involved. That might all be smoke and mirrors, who knows. But I do genuinely think with these 2026 regulations finalised, there is way more potential. But then we come to the final point of this video, which I think there's a question around sporting integrity that has come up numerous times since it was announced that Red Bull would be owning 2 teams in Formula One. Is that unfair on the rest of the grid? Obviously, Zandvoort had the conspiracy theories rife. Did Tsunoda pull up on purpose? Was it orchestrated to help out Max Verstappen? Well, no, I don't see any evidence to point towards that. I don't see any reason to point towards that. I mean, if that was the case and it was found out, that would mean expulsion from the championship for a race that Max was probably going to win anyway, if not a minimum on the podium. He's got a big championship lead, so I don't see it. But the problem is that question will always be there. Now, yes, they do run very independently and they share things, but they don't share any more than what they're allowed, in the same way that Mercedes share things with Aston Martin, Ferrari share things with Haas, etc, etc. There's loads of relationships within Formula One between the teams. Actually, last Thursday I was at Mercedes, got to do a factory tour with my old mates 8 Sleep. They have Haas CNC machines, Mercedes. So actually Mercedes buy from Haas. Even Toto Wolff managed Esteban Ocon when he was at Renault. So you could be like, oh, well, what if Ocon getting out of the way helps out Mercedes? Would Toto orchestrate that? Would Ocon feel pressure when Sebastian Vettel won the 2010 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix finale to win the championship? What helped him out? a Renault holding up Fernando Alonso. Vitaly Petrov kept him behind the whole race. And what engine was in that Red Bull? Renault. Conspiracy. Look, I joke, of course. Vitaly did a great job that day and he deserves more credit for that. There have been numerous questions, particularly asked of Haas, actually, over recent times. And Gunter always seems to think, oh, you only complain when we're doing good. When we're not doing good, you don't worry about our relationship with Ferrari. But it's true that a lot of Ferrari personnel have now moved to Haas. They've literally got a design base in Maranello, headed up by technical director Simone Resta, who used to be senior design engineer at Ferrari. The thing you've got to remember as well is that F1's a very incestuous sport. And by that, I mean that loads of people go between teams all the time. It is fairly normal. But when you've got two teams that are legally owned by the same company, I think that does raise genuine, non-conspiracy theory questions about what happens in certain situations. Does it raise more questions than, a Haas-Ferrari relationship when Haas is very, very reliant on support from Ferrari? Even though there's no legal ownership there, are they still likely to be influenced by, having their eggs in that Ferrari basket? Probably. Beyond being able to test out junior talent before giving them the promotion to the main team like they've done with Vettel, with Verstappen, and with Ricciardo, there's less risk for Red Bull trying out these young drivers at their junior team. One other area that I think Red Bull have, you could argue, unfairly gained from having that second team is that when the Honda Red Bull connection came about, it was actually first with Toro Rosso. So they used that as a test bed to test out that engine, because they had been with Renault, which then that all went sour, and then they branded it as Tag Heuer for some reason, like a watch, weird. But then they took on Honda, and obviously Honda had just had a really bad time with McLaren, but again, Red Bull were able to use that junior team as a test bed to make sure that engine was good enough to get it in their car. But what do you think? Do you think Red Bull will sell? Do you think they should sell? Or do you think they even should be forced to sell? Because to me, do I think they should be forced to sell? No. Do I think it would be ideal if one company didn't own more than one team? Yes. And I do genuinely think that that team will get sold fairly soon. But that's it. Let me know in the comments below. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.